I died in a room that smelled of candle wax and sea salt. Valencia was just beyond the stone, breathing like an animal backed into a corner. Outside the walls, the Almoravid drums kept a slow, heavy rhythm, like someone was hammering nails into the ground to pin time in place. Every beat carried the same message. This city doesn't belong to me. I'm only borrowing it, and the debt is coming due. People will say I'm already gone. But the drums don't believe it. The enemy never really believes it, not at first. They keep listening for your footsteps, for the shape of your command, because fear is a kind of faith, and they fed theirs with my name. For a moment I thought I heard Babieca in the courtyard, the scrape of a hoof on wet stone, the impatient snort of a warhorse that has learned the smell of battles before they begin. That horse carried me over bare ridges and through fields where bodies sank into the mud like spilled grain. Babieca always knew when I was lying. To kings, to enemies, to my own men, even to myself. I tried to sit up, but my chest felt like someone had laid a slab of rock on it. Air slipped through my throat with a dry rasp, and the taste of iron climbed into my mouth, blood and the bitter truth behind it. Jimena sat beside the bed. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded as if she were holding them in place by will alone. She didn't cry. She learned not to cry the day Burgos shut its gates in my face, the day she realized that tears are just another kind of tax, and the crown always collects. Alvar Fanez stood at the door like a shield that had decided to become a man. He didn't look at me for long. He kept his eyes angled toward the walls, toward the sound that mattered, the drums, the siege, the pressure. I spoke quietly because even my voice felt heavy. Don't let them see me weak. Jimena answered without lifting her chin. I have never let anyone see you weak. I wanted to laugh. I couldn't. The body doesn't always allow you the dignity of your own habits. And in that moment, something colder than fear slid into place inside me, the understanding that my death wasn't the end of my command, not here, not now, not with Valencia surrounded, not with men who were holding the line because they still believed I could walk the walls tomorrow. If the city learned I was dead, it would fall faster than any tower could crumble. A living man can lead an army, but sometimes a dead man can hold one together if the story is strong enough. In a few hours, they might dress me in armor. They might strap my body into a saddle that was never meant for the dead. They might lift me onto Babieca's back, upright, like a statue made of iron and will. They might open the gates and let the enemy see El Cid riding out through the fog, sword raised, as if death itself had failed to stop him. It wouldn't be magic,
It would be war, the oldest kind, made from fear, timing, and what men choose to believe when the world is trying to break them.
Vivar wasn't a place that tried to produce legends. It was the kind of place that produced survival. A handful of stone houses, wind that never asked permission, the smell of horses, bread, smoke from hearth fires, and wet earth after night rain. People there didn't talk about destiny. They talked about next winter. And they taught their sons the only lesson that really mattered in a small land with big lords. If you don't have land, you better have a name. If you don't have a name, you better have a sword. And if you have neither, you better learn how to stay invisible. I grew up between steel and prayer. The older knights didn't fill my head with pretty speeches. They taught me how to stand like I belonged, how to kneel without looking weak, how to lower my eyes without lowering my mind. They taught me that a court isn't just a room full of noblemen. It's a battlefield where the weapons are glances, pauses, and sentences that sound harmless until they're used against you. Most of all, they taught me silence, not the silence of fear, the silence of discipline, the kind that keeps you alive. When I was still young, I thought courage meant speaking whenever I felt the truth burning in my throat. I learned quickly that near power, the truth isn't always a shield. Sometimes it's a rope. The first time I entered the world of kings, I met Alfonso. He wasn't like the kings in songs, the ones who roar and raise their cups and promise golden ages. Alfonso didn't need to shout. He didn't need to throw his weight around. He could sit still and make a room change temperature. He looked at me the way a man looks at a blade he might need, measuring how sharp it is and how easily it might cut the hand that holds it. "Rodrigo Diaz," he said, using my name like a test. No extra titles, no warmth, just the name. "What do you swear?" I answered the way a man should answer in a court that could crush him. "I swear to serve the kingdom." The words were correct, the bow was correct, my voice was steady. But Alfonso didn't nod, he didn't smile, he didn't let me breathe easy. Instead, he asked the real question, the one hidden behind the ceremony. "And if the kingdom orders you to do something that goes against your honor?" For a moment, the room went so quiet I could hear the soft crackle of a torch. I didn't answer. Not because I was confused, because I understood what he was doing. Some questions aren't asked to be answered, they're asked to see if you'll hang yourself. If I said, "I'll obey no matter what," I'd be declaring I had no honor, just obedience. If I said, "I'll follow honor over orders," I'd be declaring myself above the crown. Either way, I would be giving him a weapon. So I did what Vivar taught me. I held the silence for one heartbeat longer than comfort, long enough for him to see I wasn't a fool. Then I lowered my head just a fraction more. "I will do what is most right for the kingdom." Alfonso repeated the phrase slowly, like he was tasting it. "Most right." And then he smiled, a thin smile, the kind that doesn't warm the eyes. I like men who know how to choose their words. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't understood in Vivar. A king doesn't just reward strength, a king measures it, a king fears it, and the more useful you are, the more carefully you're watched. Because a man with nothing can be killed, but a man who becomes necessary is a problem. I left the court with my posture straight, like I'd won something. Inside, it felt like I'd stepped out of a snare, only to realize there were more traps ahead, spread wider, set by smarter hands. On the ride back, I thought about what I'd seen in Alfonso's eyes. Not hatred, not even anger, calculation. I started to see the court for what it was,
a place where the sharpest weapons were polite, where a compliment could be a leash, where silence could be a sentence, and I began to understand my own position more clearly. I wasn't a prince. I wasn't a great lord with a dozen castles to retreat into. I was a knight with skill, with discipline, with a reputation that could grow like fire through dry grass. That reputation was the only real inheritance I had. So I trained as if it were a war, not just with sword and shield, but with my face, with my voice, with my temper. I practiced the kind of calm that doesn't come from softness, but from control, the kind of calm that makes other men wonder what you're holding back. Because I knew what was coming, even if I couldn't name it yet. In a land like ours, Castile and Leon pulling against each other, borders shifting, faith and politics tangled together, no strong man stays untested for long. A king will need him, and then fear him. A court will praise him, and then envy him, and the smallest rumor can become a reason to cast you out. So I learned how to be dangerous without looking reckless, how to speak without giving myself away, how to survive close to power. And that's the truth of Ivar. The truth nobody sings in the loudest verses. My legend didn't begin with a battle. It began with a question from a king, and the decision not to answer it the way he wanted.
The order came like a slap. Not a messenger with an apology, not a private warning from a friend in the court, just a sealed command, cold, official, final. I was accused of stepping beyond my station, of taking what wasn't mine, of becoming too visible. The words didn't need to be true, they only needed to be useful. And suddenly, everything I'd built with silence and discipline had a new name in the mouths of powerful men. Threat. I stood by the hearth in Vivar as the wax seal cracked under my thumb. The parchment felt stiff, as if even the paper had learned how to judge. I read the lines once, then again, not because I didn't understand, but because part of me refused to believe that a life could be erased by ink. The house went quiet around me. A pot stopped being stirred. A footstep froze mid-stride. You don't realize how much a home depends on certainty until certainty is taken away. Alvar arrived with dust on his cloak and steel under his calm. He didn't ask what the letter said. He read my face instead. In that moment, there was no grand speech, no vow shouted at the sky, just the practical weight of exile settling over everything like snow. Outside, horses were saddled, straps tightened, packs loaded. Every buckle clicked like a small door closing. Jimena stood apart, framed by the narrow light of a window. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She looked at me the way you look at a man walking into a storm, knowing you can't stop him, but needing him to return. That was the cruelest part. Exile doesn't only punish the man it names, it punishes everyone tied to him. By the time the sun climbed, my small band was ready. Not a great army, not a proud procession, just a handful of men who either believed in me, owed me, or had nowhere else to go. The kind of men history pretends are background until they become the foundation of something bigger. We rode for Burgos. In my mind, Burgos was still a place where honor meant something, a city with a heart, a city that would remember the service I'd given. I told myself I only needed one night, one roof, one corner of warmth before the road became truly hostile. But when we reached the gate, Burgos was already closing. Not because the people hated me, because they feared the king more than they trusted me. The gate stood tall and silent, iron bands, heavy wood, stone arch like the mouth of a beast, and in that mouth there was no welcome, only the law. A crier's voice carried over the crowd, reading the decree in public, as if shame needed an audience. Faces appeared behind shutters, then vanished.
Doors that would have opened for me yesterday stayed bolted today. I rode closer, and the city felt like it was holding its breath. From an upper window, an older woman leaned out, not a noble, not a courtier, just a citizen trapped between compassion and punishment. Her hands gripped the sill, her voice trembling. "Forgive us. The king forbids anyone from taking you in. If we disobey, we lose our homes." That sentence contained an entire kingdom's truth. Royal power doesn't only strike with swords, it strikes through fear. It makes ordinary people into the locks that keep a door shut. I looked up at her and nodded, because there was nothing else to do. Anger would be childish, threats would be useless, begging would be beneath us both. Then I saw it, briefly, at a doorway, a child stepping out as if drawn by curiosity, and a mother yanking him back so hard he stumbled. Not cruelty, protection. And that too is what a degree does. It teaches people that kindness is dangerous. My men watched me, waiting for an order, waiting for rage, waiting for a miracle. I didn't give them any of that. I held the reins loosely, letting my horse stand calm, and I spoke so the people could hear me without hearing blame. "I'm not asking for bread. I'm asking for one night under a roof." Then I paused, because the pause mattered. "But law is law. We go." I turned the horse away from Burgos, and the city stayed silent behind me. I felt eyes on my back, some ashamed, some relieved, some simply afraid. We regrouped outside the walls on muddy ground where the city's shadow didn't reach. Men adjusted straps, redistributed packs, checked the small coin pouch that now meant everything. The numbers inside were honest, and honesty is brutal. We didn't have much. Alvar came beside me, his voice low. "Where now?" I looked east. I didn't say the name immediately. The name carried weight, and I needed the weight to land properly. "Where they need a sword," I said, "where survival is paid for." He held my gaze, understanding what that meant. It meant leaving the familiar world of court loyalties and stepping into borderlands where alliances shift like sand. It meant becoming something the king could no longer command, unless he paid the price. That night, we camped under a sky that offered no comfort. The fire was small, the wind was sharp, men spoke quietly if they spoke at all. I crouched in the dirt with a rough map scratched into the earth. Not a real map, just a memory of roads and rivers and distances learned by riding them. I drew a line with the tip of my dagger, eastward toward Aragon, toward Zaragoza. A few men leaned in, listening. "Discipline," I told them. "That's how we live. Not bravado, not shouting, discipline." They nodded because discipline was the only thing we still owned. Later, when the camp fell into uneasy sleep, I stayed awake. I saw Jimena in my mind, standing in the doorway with an oil lamp, her face steady, her eyes telling me the same thing she always told me without speaking. Survive. I stared into the fire until the embers dimmed, and there, in that quiet, I made a decision that would follow me for the rest of my life. I would not plead anymore. A man can survive on honor, but an army survives on money, a city survives on grain, a kingdom survives on fear and necessity. If Castile didn't want me, I would make myself necessary to everyone else. Not out of revenge, out of reality. At dawn, we moved again. Frost clung to blankets, horses steamed in the cold air, men rose stiffly, pulling on gear with a slow effort of tired bodies. Every strap tightened was a promise we could not afford to break. As we rode, villages watched us pass. Some made the sign of the cross, some lowered their eyes, some stared with the blank expression of people who didn't know whether to fear us or hope we might protect them. Burgos faded behind, swallowed by distance and haze. Ahead, the road stretched wide and empty, and I understood something clearly for the first time. The king had cast me out to make me smaller. But exile doesn't only shrink a man. Sometimes it burns away everything soft until only purpose remains. And purpose, when it's sharpened by hunger and humiliation, becomes a blade that doesn't need a kingdom's permission to cut.
Zaragoza didn't ask me what I believed. It asked what I could do. The road into Aragon was dry and bright, the kind of brightness that makes every shadow look sharper. My men rode in a tight line, dust rising behind us like a warning we carried on purpose. Ahead, the city sat on the plain by the river, walls and towers, watchful and old, shaped by a frontier that never truly slept. Zaragoza was different from Castile, different language in the marketplace, different patterns in the stone, arches that curved like horseshoes, courtyards with fountains, and men who watched you without rushing to judge what faith you followed. Here, survival was practical. Here, alliances shifted because they had to, not because someone wrote a song about honor. At the gate, they inspected me like a tool. Hands checked my sword belt, fingers tested straps and buckles, eyes measured my men, how many, how disciplined, how hungry. The captain didn't insult me. He didn't flatter me. He simply decided whether I was worth letting inside. I kept my posture calm, hands open, gaze steady. It wasn't submission. It was strategy. Inside the city, the streets were alive, markets under awnings, smoke from cooking fires, the smell of spices and animal sweat, and river water. Donkeys pulled carts, merchants argued softly, children darted between legs, and everywhere there were eyes, curious, wary, calculating, not hostile, just honest. We crossed the city like a rumor walking on two legs, and then we reached the palace, fortified, guarded, and quietly rich. Not a castle in the northern style, but something built by men who understood heat and shade, stone and water. Arcades, tilework, lanterns beginning to glow as evening approached. They led me into an audience chamber where the Taifa ruler sat with advisors and guards. The room was heavy with oil lamp smoke and careful silence. This was not a man who thought of war as glory. This was a man who thought of war as expense. He looked at me and saw what Alfonso had seen, a blade that could solve problems and create them. The negotiations were simple, because they had to be. Gold was brought forward, coins that caught the lamplight like small suns. I didn't smile. I didn't pretend it was beneath me. I took it with steady hands. Because I wasn't here to be admired. I was here to live. That night in camp outside the city, my men ate in quiet circles around low fires. Some of the Taifa soldiers watched us from their own tents, still uncertain whether to trust Christians under a Muslim banner. I understood them. Trust is expensive on a frontier. An Andalusia officer came to speak with me. He spoke respectfully, but carefully. He didn't call me friend. He didn't call me enemy. He spoke as one professional to another, explaining the problem, the rivals, the need. I listened more than I spoke. I asked about roads, about river crossings, about supply depots, about which villages could feed an army, and which would hide their grain, about which allies would fold, and which would fight. Because battles aren't won by courage alone, they're won by bread. At dawn, I walked among the mule trains and grain sacks and amphorae of oil, and I watched the scribes counting rations. The sound of war isn't only steel, it's the scratch of a quill, the thud of a sack, the creak of rope under load. And I learned something that would shape everything that came after. A commander who controls the supply, controls the fight. When the enemy finally appeared on the plain, distant movement under a hard blue sky, my scout signaled from a ridge. I raised a hand and the column stopped. Horses settled, men tightened their grips. The wind carried dust into mouths and eyes, making everyone blink like they were waking from a dream. I rode along the line giving short orders. No speeches, no promises of heaven, just clarity. When the charge came, it came like thunder. Horses accelerated from trot to gallop, muscles working hard, tacks snapping, dust exploding under hooves. Lances lowered, shields angled, and then the impact, wood splintering, bodies recoiling, men falling with the heavy finality that no song can soften. I fought on foot in the thick of it, where the air tastes like dirt and sweat and metal. I didn't swing wildly. Wild men die quickly. I used the shield ram to trap a blade, stepped inside, ended the thread with a decisive strike. It was brutal. It was real. And it was the only language that battle respects. Alvar was near me, moving like the man I trusted most. Shield bash, shortcut, step back into balance. No wasted motion, no show, just survival turned into skill. The moment that mattered wasn't the loudest moment. It was the moment the enemy line began to waver. That's
But you don't chase chaos. You create it. I signaled the flank. Riders peeled away in a controlled arc, horses leaning into the turn, dust trailing behind like a blade's wake. A horn sounded, the line tightened, the pressure shifted, and the enemy broke. Afterward, in the settling dust, the battlefield looked smaller than it had in the morning. Not because it was less deadly, because death has a way of shrinking all ambition down to the size of a body. A prisoner knelt near my men, hands up. He surrendered. He wanted to live. I told him the rule. Drop the weapon and you live. Then a small knife slipped from his sleeve and hit the dirt. I looked at him and he saw there would be no mercy for a lie. He dropped his eyes. The knife was taken. The message went through the survivors like cold water. My mercy was real, but it was not naive. When we returned to Zaragoza, the gates opened wide. Citizens watched from balconies and streets. No one cheered like a festival. This was not that kind of city. But the looks changed. The whispers changed. The way guards stood a little straighter changed. Respect is a currency too. That night in the palace, they offered me a gift. A long wooden box. The room went quiet when it appeared, as if everyone understood what a symbol can do. I opened it and found an old sword inside. Worn, nicked, honest steel. Not a shining relic. Not a magical artifact. Just a blade that had lived through other hands before it reached mine. I lifted it and tested its balance with a small wrist turn. It sat right. It felt like something that could become a story. Later, alone near a fountain in the courtyard, I drew the blade part way. Steel sang softly in the night air. The clean sound of a weapon that hasn't forgotten its purpose. I could have called it anything. But names matter. Names travel faster than men. And soon, in camp, in the streets, in the mouths of soldiers who didn't share my faith but respected my discipline, they began to call me something else. Sidi, they said. A word that means my lord. The Christians heard it, and shaped it into a sound they could carry. Sid. I didn't choose it. It chose me. And that was the beginning of the most dangerous thing a man can become on a battlefield and in a court. Not just a warrior. A name. Because once you become a name, you stop belonging only to yourself. You belong to the fear of your enemies, the hopes of your men, and the calculations of kings far away. Kings who will eventually hear that their exile has not disappeared. It has.
The Almoravids came like a verdict. Not like the Taifa armies I'd learned to read, fractured, negotiable, always one letter away from betrayal. These men marched as if the desert itself had taught them discipline. Their standards were dark against the horizon, and their movement had the quiet certainty of something that didn't intend to leave. In the south, the king's banners were breaking. After the battle, mud, torn cloth, broken spears, the smoke of ruined tents, Castile and Leon looked less like a kingdom and more like a wound. Wounded men were carried past the royal pavilion. Horses trembled. Soldiers who had once spoken of victory now spoke only in short sentences, like they were afraid to waste breath. Inside the pavilion, Alfonso stood over a map as if he could hold the border in place with his hands. He didn't rage. Alfonso was never the kind of king who needed to shout to be feared. His anger was quieter than that, controlled, measured, turned inward until it became calculation. He looked at the marks on the parchment, rivers, roads, the broken line of the frontier, and then his gaze shifted, northeast, away from the battlefield, away from the men who had failed him, toward a name he had tried to remove from his kingdom. Mine. In that moment, I understood something that most men never learn until it's too late. A king can cast you out, but a king cannot always replace you. A summons was written,
Wax warmed, the signet pressed down with the finality of a sentence. No apology, no admission of error, just the cold truth wrapped in protocol. The crown needed a sword it could not find anywhere else. A courier rode hard across the plains, dust behind him, horse breathing like bellows, a leather satchel bouncing against his hip. He didn't ride like a messenger bringing good news. He rode like a man carrying a fire that could burn a kingdom if it arrived too late. When he reached my camp near Saragossa, the sun was already high, and the air had the dry bite of Aragon. He reined in hard, boots hit the ground, and he ran straight toward my tent as if the fabric walls were the only thing standing between him and disaster. Inside, my world was simpler. A lamp, a map, a sword, the quiet routine of men who had learned to live without permission. He handed me the sealed letter. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The wax alone carried the weight of a throne. I broke the seal slowly, not for drama, for control. The message was short, and it said exactly what I expected. The kingdom needed me. Not, "We are sorry," not, "Return with honor," just, "Need." I read it once, then looked up at Alvar as he stepped into the tent. He searched my face the same way he always had, looking for the decision behind the expression. I folded the letter and set it down. "We're moving," I said. We packed at dawn. Tents came down, saddles were tightened, straps pulled until leather creaked. Men moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who already knew the direction without being told. No celebration, no victory songs. This wasn't a triumph. It was a return to a place that had already betrayed me once. We rode west. The road back toward Castile felt different than the road into exile. Back then, the distance behind me was filled with anger. Now it was filled with something sharper, certainty. As we passed villages, we saw what the Almoravid shadow had started to do. Refugees, burned thatch, people walking with bundles tied to their backs, eyes fixed on the ground as if looking up might invite another disaster. The land itself looked tired. At one ruined chapel, I dismounted and placed a hand on the scorched stone. It was still warm in places, as if the fire hadn't decided it was finished. I didn't pray out loud. I didn't make a speech. I remounted and we moved on, because sentiment doesn't stop an army. When Toledo's walls rose ahead, the air tightened again. The city was rich, heavy with stone and history, and full of faces that could smile while sharpening knives. As my party rode through the gate, people watched from doorways and balconies. Some recognized me, some pretended not to. Some looked afraid, as if my return meant war was following close behind. They were right. In the Alcazar courtyard, I dismounted and handed my reins to a groom. Alvar stayed a step behind me, close enough to fight, far enough to let the court see I wasn't walking in as a conqueror. They led me through torchlit corridors, past tapestries and guards, toward the throne hall where the air always felt colder than it should. When I entered, the room turned its attention the way a pack turns toward a new animal, testing, measuring, deciding where it might be weakest. Alfonso stood on the dais, draped in authority. He watched me as if I were a blade he had once thrown away and now needed to pick up without cutting his hand. "Rodrigo Diaz," he said. "No warmth, no welcome. Your service under other banners has made you rich." I met his gaze without flinching. It kept me alive. The court went still. You could feel the risk in the air. One wrong word and the summons could turn back into exile. Alfonso leaned forward slightly, not enough to look eager,
just enough to remind everyone who controlled the room. Do you know what men say about you here? I've heard enough, I said. He studied me for a long beat, and then he spoke the line he had been holding back like a knife behind his sleeve. You are a sword that walks by itself. There it was, the truth of it, the fear beneath the need. I bowed my head only a fraction. A sword can still cut for the king, if the king knows how to hold it. It was a dangerous answer, but danger was already written into my name. I couldn't pretend to be harmless, not anymore. Alfonso's smile was thin, approval and warning in the same breath. He offered me a commission, sealed and formal, but he also offered me chains wrapped in silk, royal observers, layered commands, reminders that any victory belonged to the kingdom, not to the man who earned it. I took the scroll anyway, because I understood the game. I wasn't returning to be loved, I was returning to be used. And for now, I needed the king's permission, not because I respected it, but because it gave me room to build something the king couldn't easily touch. When I left the throne hall, the corridors felt narrower, the watchers felt closer, and behind me, I could feel Alfonso's gaze, calculating, uneasy, unable to decide whether he had just saved his kingdom or invited a future threat inside the walls. Out on the road again, away from the court's smoke and whispers, I unrolled a map on the saddle and traced the coastline with a gloved finger. Not south, not back into the king's failing wars. East, toward the sea, toward the place a man could hold with walls, wealth, and ships, far enough from the throne to breathe, close enough to be impossible to ignore. Valencia. Alfonso had called me back because he needed a sword. He didn't realize that a sword, once it learns to walk, doesn't always return to the sheath.
When I first saw Valencia from the coastal ridge, the sea looked like a sheet of hammered silver. Wind came up from the water and carried salt into my lungs like a warning. Below, the city sat behind its walls, stone and plaster, towers and arches, rooftops packed tight, and beyond them the harbor, the masts, the warehouses, the wealth. Valencia wasn't just a city, it was a key to food, a key to money, a key to ships, and a key to a kind of power that didn't need the king's permission every time it moved. I reined in my horse and stared until the shape of the place sank into my bones. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My men felt it too, the pull of that city, the promise and the danger wrapped together like a blade in a cloth. If I could hold Valencia, I could feed an army without begging. I could pay men without borrowing. I could answer Alfonso with tribute instead of obedience. So I didn't rush at it like a raider. I began the way you begin any real siege, with patience. From a rough shelter on the hill, I spread my maps and traced the roads that fed Valencia, the villages, the water channels, the junctions where grain carts and oil amphorae rolled toward the gates. I didn't need to smash the walls right away. Walls are stubborn. People are not. First, I needed to tighten the roads. My scouts moved out at dawn and returned with dust on their cloaks and the smell of fields on their boots. They pointed out where merchants traveled, where guards changed, where a lone rider could slip through at night. I didn't give long speeches. I gave short orders. Then I watched the results. We blocked a road with shields and spears, not with bloodlust, just presence.
A merchant convoy approached, mule carts creaking, sacks stacked high. The drivers slowed when they saw us. Fear and calculation flickered across their faces. I stepped forward and spoke like a man who intended to be there tomorrow. "You can pass," I told them, "but you pass under my protection, and protection has a price. I didn't take everything. A thief takes until the victim fights back. A ruler takes just enough to make the system work." We unloaded a portion of the grain. We counted it. We sealed it. And then we handed the merchants a safe conduct token so they could travel without being robbed on the next road. That was the lesson I'd learned in exile. If you want people to fear you, you can hurt them once. If you want them to cooperate, you have to give them something they can keep. In my camp, sacks piled up. Men counted and recorded. Guards posted at the stores. Every detail mattered, because a siege isn't only fought at the wall, it's fought in the ledger. At night, I did the quieter work. A hooded man met me near an orchard wall beyond the city. He didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a man who had learned to survive under every regime. His hands shook when he saw the coins, but he took them anyway. That's what fear does to people. It turns loyalty into a marketplace. I didn't ask him to love me. I asked him to open a hinge at the right moment. Piece by piece, Valencia's confidence began to crack. Inside the walls, the marketplace grew tense. Lanterns lit. Vendors measured smaller portions. Faces turned cautious. Rumors moved faster than carts. The roads are unsafe. The supplies are shrinking. The gates are watched. Outside the walls, my patrols became a clock. Riders moved in disciplined loops, always visible enough to be felt, never so reckless that they could be drawn into a trap. And then, to make sure the people who mattered trusted me more than they feared the chaos, I did something many conquerors failed to do. I punished my own men. A looter was caught in an alley with stolen cloth and bread. The easy answer would have been to ignore it. Let the soldiers take what they want. That's how many armies keep themselves happy. It's also how cities become ashes. I had the goods returned in public, not with a spectacle of cruelty, but with a clear message: no one is allowed to steal under my banner. Not because I was merciful, because I was building a machine, and machines break when parts move for themselves. Merchants noticed, villagers noticed, even the people who hated me noticed. Then a band of robbers tried to take advantage of the fear outside the city. They rushed a road near one of the villages under my protection. My men formed a shield line in seconds, feet planted, spears leveled. No shouting, no chaos. I stepped in and ended it fast. One clean shield bash, one shortcut, no theatrical swings. The leader fell hard, and the rest broke. When the dust settled, I had the survivors bound and removed. Again, no spectacle, just law. And suddenly the story outside Valencia changed. Not because people loved me, but because they could predict me. Predictability is power. By the time my earthworks started to rise, trenches, palisades, timber stacks, the city's leaders understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't a raid, this was a slow tightening. Siege engines were assembled with patience and sweat. Men lifted beams with shoulders and hips engaged, straining under real weight. Ropes tightened. Iron fittings were hammered into place. The work was ugly and honest. On the walls, defenders watched and grew paler. Inside the city, arguments flared in council chambers. Outside, I read captured letters from messengers who tried to slip through orchards at night. My scouts intercepted them quietly, pulled wax-sealed messages from satchels, and brought them to my table at dawn. War is fought with steel, but it is won with information. Then Alfonso's letter arrived. Even here, even on the edge of the sea, the king's shadow could reach me. The message was sharp. You are building power for yourself. He wasn't wrong. I wrote back carefully. I am building a wall for the kingdom where the kingdom has no hand. It was the kind of sentence that sounds loyal, but leaves the truth between the lines. I sent it, sealed, and returned to my work, because I knew Alfonso would never truly trust me, and I also knew he needed me too much to stop me, at least for now. As the weeks passed, the ring around Valencia tightened. Patrols rotated, outposts appeared, roads emptied. I left one corridor open at times, Not out of kindness, but because a trapped city fights harder. If you give people a way out, you control the direction of their desperation. At dawn, refugees moved along that corridor with bundles on their backs. Children clutched bread. They looked back at the walls, and then forward at the road. My men stood aside with spears lowered. No shouting, no striking. Discipline again, because even mercy can be strategy. Some nights, I walked the beach alone. The waves came in and went out like breath. Moonlight laid a pale path across the water. The wind pulled at my cloak and made the whole world feel wider than any kingdom. And there, with the sea whispering and the city behind me tightening into hunger, I asked myself the question I couldn't ask in the court. What is honor now? When I was younger, honor meant never stepping back. Now I understood that honor can also mean choosing the move that keeps your men alive and keeps a city from turning into a graveyard. Back in the keep, my council gathered around oil lamps and maps. I tapped the parchment beside Valencia once, not hard, just enough to make the meaning settle. We were past the point of returning. And then, in the morning light, the Mangano crews lifted a stone into the sling. Ropes creaked, wood flexed, men braced and held. On the walls, defenders shaded their eyes and stared. Valencia had finally seen the full shape of what was coming. And I, Rodrigo Diaz, called El Cid by those who needed a name to fear, stood on the ridge above the sea and raised a hand. The lines moved, not in a rush, not in a frenzy, in a synchronized, deliberate advance, like a door closing slowly, so there's no doubt it will shut.
The last morning of the siege didn't sound like victory. It sounded like wind and breathing, and the soft creak of leather as tired men shifted their weight in place. Valencia's walls were stained with smoke and dust. The stone darkened where fire had licked it. The streets inside quiet in a way that felt unnatural for a city that rich. Beyond the fields, my camp sat like a ring of iron, earthworks, timber, watchfires, and men who had learned to wait without wasting strength. Then, on the battlements, a defender lifted a white cloth. Not a banner, not a challenge, a simple piece of fabric catching the sea wind and trembling like a hand that can't stop shaking. I didn't cheer. I didn't let my men cheer. I raised one hand and held it, and the line stayed still. Because the moment you treat surrender like a festival is the moment discipline breaks. And discipline was the only reason my army was still an army. A delegation walked out from the date, slow, exhausted, guarded. They carried the keys like a burden, not an offering, iron on a ring, cold and heavy, as if the city itself had turned into metal. I took the key ring without haste, no triumph in my face, only confirmation. Then the gates of Valencia opened. It took strength just to move them, men bracing shoulders and hips against the heavy wood, chains shifting, iron scraping. The sound echoed through the stone passage like a door opening into a different life. I rode through the gate at a walk, not because I was afraid, because speed makes people think you've come to loot, And I didn't need Valencia broken. I needed it working. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old smoke, and salt. Shutters were half closed. Faces watched from doorways. A child peeked out and disappeared again. People weren't sure if they should pray, hide, or run. My column advanced in disciplined spacing. No one broke formation to grab anything. No one shouted. Spear stayed low. Shield stayed close. If I was going to rule this place, my first act had to be control over the city and over my own men. In the central plaza, I dismounted and stood still long enough for the city to feel what was happening. Not a raid, not a riot, a change of power. I pointed to the intersections that mattered. Officers moved out with measured urgency. Guard posts appeared at corners. A storehouse door was sealed with cord and wax. A guard was posted beside it. In a conquest, the first question isn't who wins. It's who steals first. Because theft spreads faster than any army. If my soldiers began to plunder, Valencia would become a corpse within hours, and a corpse is hard to defend. So when a looter was caught in a back alley with stolen cloth and bread, I made the answer visible. He was tackled cleanly, bound tight, brought to the plaza. No beating, no spectacle of cruelty, just consequence. I ordered restitution. The stolen goods were placed back in the open, bread, cloth, small coins, and the message moved through the crowd like a low drumbeat. Under my banner, there would be rules, even for my own men. Merchants noticed. That mattered more than cheers. A city like Valencia survives on trade and trust. If merchants believe they can bring their goods through my streets without being robbed, they will keep the city alive. If they don't believe that, the city dies slowly from within, no matter how strong the walls are. I walked the streets with my officers, not as a conqueror showing off, but as a man measuring a machine. Valencia was made of many parts: Christians, Muslims, Jews, people who didn't need to love each other to live beside each other, as long as someone kept the peace. I met a priest in a small church with Romanesque stone and candlelight. I met local notables in a courtyard of arches and tilework where water whispered in a fountain. I listened more than I spoke. And I made one thing clear without ever shouting it. Your faith is not my problem. Disorder is. Then I took the next step that turns an army into a government. I opened the books. In a civic building with low tables and oil lamps, scribes began writing. Taxes, inventories, storehouse lists. Wax seals pressed into warm wax. Parchments rolled and tied. Coins weighed on scales, the pans dipping and settling like breath. It wasn't glamorous. It was power. I inspected the granaries. I ordered measured distribution. I watched bread placed into small hands, not as charity, but a strategy. A hungry city rebels. A fed city waits. While the city learned my rule, the king remained far away. Alfonso received his share of tribute, because I needed him quiet. I sent coin and goods across the roads like a polite warning. You may not like what I'm becoming, but you cannot deny I'm still useful. His answer was silence. Royal silence is its own weapon. It withholds recognition the way a hand withholds a coin, reminding everyone who was supposed to be above whom. But silence couldn't stop what was already happening inside these walls. At dawn, I walked the parapets above the sea. The horizon was pale, the water glinting, gulls circling in the salt air. Behind me, Valencia woke slowly. Below, streets began to move again, cautiously, like a wounded animal testing its legs. I watched the harbor, ships rocking in the mist, dock workers moving under watch. Whoever controls the harbor controls the lifeline. I meant to control it completely. In the courtyard, my guards drilled. Step, halt, turn, spears up, shields angled, boots striking stone in synchronized cadence. The city had to see discipline, not because discipline looks noble, because discipline looks permanent. And permanence is what makes people stop betting on your collapse. By evening, my banner rose above the keep, cloth snapping in the wind, frayed edges catching the last light.
Men hauled it up with rope tension and hard hands, and when it caught the wind, it looked like an answer. Valencia was mine. Not as a prize, as a burden. Because I knew what came next. Holding a city is harder than taking it. A conqueror only needs courage for one day. A ruler needs control for every day after. That night I stood on the roof of the keep and listened to the sea. In the dark, Valencia's lights were scattered and small. The wind never stopped, and I asked myself the question that wouldn't leave me. If I die here, will they remember Rodrigo, or will they remember El Cid? I didn't know which answer would feel lighter, but I knew one thing for certain. A city like Valencia doesn't let a man stay small. It turns him into a symbol, whether he wants it or not. And symbols attract storms.
The first sign wasn't the arrows. It was the dust. A pale brown smear on the horizon that didn't belong to wind or weather. It moved with purpose, like a shadow learning how to walk. By the time I climbed the keep terrace, the haze had thickened, and dark standards were beginning to show through it. Lines of men arriving with the kind of order you don't see in raiding parties. The Almoravids were coming. They didn't approach like the armies I had learned to bargain with. No bright competing banners, no noisy display meant to frighten the weak. Just disciplined movement, dark cloth snapping in the wind, ranks forming as if they were assembling a machine. From the wall, Valencia looked smaller than it had when I took it. Not because the stone had shrunk, because the enemy beyond it had grown into something that didn't care about stories. I stood at the parapet and watched their camps spread across the plain. Rows of tents, fires in measured lines, trenches cut with patience. Their order wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to endure. And in a siege, endurance is a weapon. Inside Valencia, I called my officers to the council chamber. Oil lamps smoked, maps were unrolled, voices rose, fear disguised as argument. I lifted one hand, and the room went still. There's a moment in every crisis when people stop asking what's right and start asking what survives. I told them what we were going to do: tighten the city, ration what we had, hold the walls, and keep the mind of the garrison from collapsing before the stone did. That's where Jimena became more than my wife. She went to the granaries with scribes and guards, counting sacks and measuring what was left like a surgeon measuring blood loss. She marked ration lines on parchment, pressed wax seals, ordered locks checked, posted men where temptation would be strongest. Because hunger turns honest men into thieves, and thieves turn cities into graves. At dawn, people lined up for bread. No shouting, no riots, because we didn't allow it. Portions were small, hands reached out quietly, and eyes avoided each other. The city learned a new rhythm, not the rhythm of markets and festivals, but the rhythm of survival. Outside the walls, the enemy began to speak in arrows. Their archers moved with frightening coordination. Volleys rose and fell like a mechanical tide. On the battlements, my men lifted shields, ducked, moved along the stone with disciplined timing. Arrows hit wood and stone with solid, ugly impact. Splinters flew, stone chipped. A man yanked an arrow free from a shield rim with a sharp pull, then forced himself back into position. That's what war looks like when it becomes daily life. Not heroism, routine. At sunset, I walked the wall line. Sea mist clung to the stone. Wind pulled at cloaks and banners. The faces I passed were hollowing out. Men running on less sleep, less food, less hope. I spoke to them in short sentences. I didn't promise glory. I didn't promise rescue. I promised structure. Don't look at their numbers, I told them. Look at the distance. They're out there, we're here, and this wall is reality. Some men nodded because they believed me. Others nodded because they needed to believe something.
In the infirmary, medics worked under candlelight, lifting mail carefully from wounded shoulders, wrapping linen with tight, practiced hands. The groans were low, exhausted, even pain seemed tired. Outside at night, the Almoravid campfires formed a ring. In the fog coming off the sea, the lights looked like eyes. Their patrols moved with measured canes, spear tips glinting, standards steady. No chaos, no wasted motion, just pressure. That kind of discipline doesn't break easily. On the rooftops, Valencia listened to the enemy drums, slow, heavy beats that didn't speed up, didn't falter, didn't get excited. A rhythm meant to tell us, we can wait longer than you can. I stood alone on a terrace and listened, perfectly still, while the wind tugged at my cloak. Cities fall long before the gates open. They fall when the mind gives up. That's why even in the middle of all this, I kept doing the unglamorous work. We intercepted messengers trying to slip out through orchards at night, quiet grapbles in the dark, sealed letters pulled from satchels, wax stamps still intact when they hit my table at dawn. Information is food for a siege. It tells you what the city can endure and what the enemy expects you to do when you can't. Jimena cracked down on theft when a hand reached for grain in the stores. A guard clamped the wrist instantly. The thief was bound, removed, made an example, not in cruelty but in certainty. Because in a starving city, one stolen sack becomes 10, and 10 becomes collapse. I felt the siege in my body too. Some nights the wind seasoned like metal. Some mornings I woke with my mouth dry and my muscles heavy, as if sleep itself had become labor. But I didn't allow myself to luxury of weakness, not openly, not where the walls could hear. Then came the dream. Moonlight over the sea, thick fog swallowing the horizon, a shape on a distant rock, white cloth, stillness, an arm lifting to point toward the city. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't fireworks from heaven, it was the mind under pressure, pulling symbols out of mist and exhaustion, but it left a cold mark behind my ribs. I woke before dawn, sweat on my skin, and I understood the truth the dream was trying to tell me. The siege wasn't just about stone. It was about belief. And belief can be guided. In the War Council, I moved markers on the map with Jimena and Alvar. Gates, stocks, patrol routes. A plan that didn't depend on luck, only on discipline holding longer than hunger. There were sorties, small clashes at a postern gate when defenders tried to strike at our lines. Shield walls met them, spears thrust and were redirected. Bodies hit the ground with the heavy finality of real impact, and when the moment passed, I signaled hold, and my men stopped pursuit instantly. Control again. Not because I didn't want blood. Because blood is expensive when you can't replace it. Then the storm came, wind-driven mist, waves slamming the rocks, rain dragging down torches until flames sputtered and steadied again. Even weather tried to finish what the enemy began. After the storm, the fog was thicker, the trenches darker, the standards more ghost-like, and still they moved, still they dug, still they waited. Inside Valencia, our supplies shrunk. Jimena moved sacks into secured rooms, posted guards, checked seals, reduced portions with the steady hand of someone who knows that kindness without calculation becomes betrayal. One night on the stair landing, she reached for my forearm, just a brief touch through mail and cloth, and I felt how much she was carrying. Not only grief for the life we'd lost, the city itself. We didn't speak much, we didn't have to. The siege had its own voice, and it spoke through hunger, through drums, through the way men's eyes lingered on the horizon as if looking hard enough could summon rescue. At dawn, I stood on the warden, sea mist in my face, banners snapping above us, and I pointed first to the horizon, where the enemy waited, and then to the stone beneath our feet. Here, I told them without speeches, is where we live. And for now, Valencia held. Not because the enemy was weak. Because discipline, hard, cold, daily discipline, was still stronger than despair. But even as the city survived, I knew the truth beneath every breath. A siege is not a single battle. It is time weaponized. And time was the one enemy we could never kill.
The news didn't reach me on the battlefield. It reached me the way most things that break a man arrive, sealed in wax, carried by a tired horse, delivered by hands that won't meet your eyes. Far from Valencia, on the dry plains near Consuegra, men were already forming lines beneath a cold dawn. Cross banners snapped in the wind, shields were stacked, horses steamed as they breathed into the air. The fortress on the rise watched everything in silence, like it had seen too many suns leave and too few return. Diego was there. My son wasn't a boy anymore, mail on his shoulders, A sword bilt tightened with steady hands, eyes focused forward, like he had rehearsed courage until it felt natural. He adjusted his gear the way a soldier does when he wants to convince his body that nothing can touch him. War always gives young men that illusion right before it takes it away. Across the plain, the Almoravid ranks moved with the same discipline that haunted Valencia. Dark standards, tight formation, and advance that didn't care about promises or prayers. When the clash began, it wasn't the clean collision of songs. It was dust and noise and bodies hitting the ground too hard. Lances splintered against shields, horses pushed through men, spears slid, glanced, found gaps. The world became smaller, down to breathing, footing, and the weight of a blade in your hand. Diego fought in that mess, shield up, sword kite, stepping forward because that's what men do when they're trying to become worthy of a name. For a moment he held. For a moment he looked like the future. Then the line bent. Pressure builds in battle the way it builds in a siege, not all at once, but steadily until something gives. Men step back, then stumble, then fall. A single mistake spreads through a formation like fire through dry grass. Somewhere in that dust, Diego was struck. It could have been an arrow, a spear, a blade that slipped past the shield rim for a heartbeat. The details don't matter when the result is the same. He stumbled, his knees buckled. He hit the earth hard, the kind of hard that steals breath and makes the world tilt. His gauntlets scraped dirt as his fingers tried to grip the ground, trying as if holding the soil could keep him from leaving it. Men rushed to him, friends, comrades, boys with older faces, lifting his armored weight under the arms, staggering backwards as the battlefield swallowed them. They dragged him towards an improvised medical tent where linen strips and water basins waited like poor excuses for miracles. Hands pressed cloth against his wound, voices were shouted, orders were given, but blood doesn't negotiate, and death doesn't listen. Dust settled on his lashes. He blinked once, slow and distant, and then the movement stopped. By dusk, the camp was packing in defeated silence. Fires burned low, cross banners sagged. Men avoided looking at each other too long, because looking means remembering. A message was sealed for me. A courier rode out into the fading light, horse pushing forward over the road, as if speed could change what had already happened. He crossed scrubland and river forts, splashing through shallow water, dust trailing behind him, never slowing for comfort. When he reached Valencia, dawn was coming up off the sea. Mist clung to the walls. Guards opened the gate. The courier dismounted stiffly, legs tired, and ran through the keep corridors, where torch smoke hung in the arches. He found my chamber. He knelt. He held out the sealed pouch, and in his posture, I read the truth before the wax broke. I took it without speaking. I broke the seal slowly, because sudden movements would have been useless. The paper inside felt too light for what it carried. I unfolded it and read. My eyes moved across the lines, then stopped, because there are moments when the mind refuses to step forward, even when the body must. I felt my breath catch once, just once. My shoulders stiffened like a man hit from behind. Then my hand crushed the parchment hedge slightly, wrinkling it, as if I could change the sentence by force. I let go. I forced my fingers to relax. Discipline doesn't stop grief. It only decides how grief is allowed to appear. Jimena entered quietly. She didn't ask the question. She looked at my face and understood. Her eyes softened for a breath, and then steadied again, because she knew what I knew. If I fell apart, the city would fall with me.
So I stood, and I went to the chapel. Candles burned low. Incense haze softened the stone. I knelt, and the weight of my armor settled with a dull clink, heavier than it had any right to be. I clasped my hands and stared at the crucifix until my eyes burned. I didn't ask God why. A man who has lived through war stops asking that question, because he knows the answer is always the same, because it happens. I swallowed hard. I breathed shallowly, and then I rose. Duty doesn't wait for morning. Later, on the rooftop parapet, the sea horizon looked pale and endless. The wind snapped banners and tugged in my cloak. I stood there alone and felt something inside me change shape. Grief is not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet weight that makes a man older in a single night. I remember Diego as a child, frost in his breath, small hands gripping a wooden hilt, trying to swing like the grown men. He had looked up at me with eyes that wanted approval more than anything. That memory cut deeper than the letter. Then the city called me back. The walls needed walking. The guards needed seeing. The wounded needed the illusion that their suffering mattered to someone who could still save them. I moved through the parapets and infirmary with the same measured calm I always wore, because calm in a siege is contagious. I sat with Jimena at the ledger table, candlelight flickering over ration lines. She pointed to numbers. I marked the new cut with a finger that didn't tremble, because even grief must obey arithmetic. At night I stood on the terrace again, and the city lights below looked small and far away. The enemy's campfires glowed beyond the walls like a ring of patient eyes. The sea wind now stopped. In the courtyard, Babieca stood in fog, lantern light trembling across its coat. The horse exhaled a long plume of vapor, ears forward, as if waiting for a command that hadn't been spoken yet. When I saw Babieca like that, something in my chest tightened. Not pain this time, but the first hint of a colder realization. The siege would not end because I was tired. It would not end because I had lost my son. It would only end when one side ran out of time. And I understood, with the cruel clarity that comes after tragedy, that I could not afford to spend my strength on mourning the way ordinary men do. I would mourn Diego in the only way war allows, by holding the wall, by refusing to let my name, my son's name, become a footnote under an enemy standard. So I kept walking. I kept planning. I kept breathing. And somewhere in the mist, my horse waited, as if it already knew that the next battle might not be fought with a living man at all.
The siege was outside the walls, but another siege had begun inside my body. It started small, something you could hide if you chose your moments carefully. A cough you blamed on sea air, a breath that came a little shorter after a walk along the parapet, a heaviness in the chest that felt like armor you couldn't take off. In Valencia, the wind never stopped. It brought salt through the slit windows, into chambers and corridors, into candle flames that trembled like they were unsure whether they were allowed to burn. I told myself the air was the reason. I told myself I could outlast it. Then, one night, I doubled over in my chamber and coughed hard into my fist. My shoulders hunched as if the illness had hands and was trying to fold me in half. When it passed, I steadied myself on the table edge, fingers biting into the wood until my knuckles turned pale.
I looked at my hand afterward, how it trembled for a moment before I forced it still. A man can hide blood on a battlefield. It's harder to hide weakness in a city that depends on your spine. Jimena came down the corridor with the quiet speed of someone who already knows the truth and refuses to say it out loud. When she entered, she didn't ask me questions. She didn't bring panic into the room. She simply placed her hand on my shoulder. I leaned into it for the smallest moment, just enough to feel support. Then I pulled myself upright again, because habit is a kind of armor too. I tried to stand, my legs engaged, my hips lifted me halfway, and then my body made the decision for me. I sat back down with a breath I couldn't control. The city outside my window was still under siege. The enemy still waited. The wall still needed a man to walk it. But my body was starting to refuse the job. At dawn, I went to the chapel. Candles burned low. Incense haze softened the stone. I knelt, and it felt like the weight of my mail had doubled. I held my hands together and tried to pray my way back into strength. The prayer didn't change anything. It only made the truth clearer. When I rose, my breath was shallow. My eyes stayed focused because I forced them to. I walked the parapets anyway. I moved along the wall with a gait that had grown heavier, one step at a time, resting my hand on the stone when I needed to hide the pause. I watched my boots on the stone when the world tilted for a heartbeat. I corrected the stumble like a soldier corrects a misstep in formation, quick, quiet, invisible. I was still the commander, even if the command was costing me more than it used to. In the courtyard, the guard drill continued. Step, halt, turn, shields angled, spears raised, boots striking stone in synchronized rhythm. I gave signals instead of speeches. I kept my gestures clean, my face calm, because the men watched my eyes more than they watched the horizon. If I looked tired, they would become afraid. If I looked afraid, they would break. At dusk, in the council room, maps were spread under oil lamps. Ration ledgers sat like accusations beside them. I pointed to gates, routes, stores. I tried to keep my voice steady. Then the cough hit again, sharp, ugly, impossible to ignore. Jimena didn't react like a frightened woman. She reacted like a commander. Her eyes fixed on me for one breath too long, the way a person looks at a crack in a wall and measures how fast it might spread. Then she returned to the map, calm, precise, unmoved in front of the others. But later, when we were alone, she touched my forehead with the back of her hand. Hot, her silence said, and for the first time, I couldn't pretend it was only the wind. I tried to rise from the bed again and failed. I pushed up on my elbows, shoulders straining, and then I collapsed back with a breath that tasted of defeat. Alvar stood outside in the torchlit corridor. He heard the coughing, and I could imagine his jaw tightening, his hand hovering near his sword as if steel got sickness. It can't. That helplessness is what makes illness feel like an enemy. The siege still demanded work, so I forced myself onto the wall at sunset and walked it one more time, gripping the parapet stone when my legs wanted to fold. Below, the sea glowed, and the enemy camp sat like a patient animal. The wind snapped banners and made everything look sharper than it was. I knew then that I had entered a new kind of countdown, not in days, not in weeks. In breaths. And that's when the preparations began. Quietly. In the keep workshop, under low firelight and smoke, craftsmen and leather workers measured a saddle frame and laid out thick straps and iron buckles.
They didn't call it anything. They didn't ask questions. They did their work with the focus of men building something they hoped they would never need. But they knew. Because in a fortress, secrets don't stay silent. They just learn to move in whispers. In the stable yard, Babieca stood in fog, lantern balls of light trembling across its coat. The horse exhaled a long plume of vapor, ears forward, as if it could smell the change in the air before any man spoke it. I saw the reinforced saddle in my mind long before it was finished, a brutal piece of practicality. Not for comfort, not for war. For posture. For the shape of a man who must appear unbroken even when he is no longer living. In the chapel, a priest prepared rites with capeful hands. In my chamber, Jimena and Alvar exchanged looks that said everything without saying a word. No one could afford to speak openly yet, not with the walls listening, not with fear waiting to spread. I held a wooden crucifix once, fingers trembling around the grain and steadying my grip, not because I thought it would save me, but because I wanted something solid in my hand as the world began to soften at the edges. At night, Jimena sat at my bedside with hands clasped, posture unbroken, watching my breathing the way a commander watches a gate, waiting for the moment it fails. I whispered something to her, not for the room, for her. A last instruction, a last piece of trust. Outside, Babieca pawed once in the fog and then stood still again. In the workshop, the saddle was tested, straps tightened to the last notch, buckles clicked, leather creaked under tension, the frame held. And then one morning the wall line shifted slightly as guards realized something without being told. I wasn't there. A gap. A silence that didn't belong. Jimena moved through the keep corridors with the calm of a blade. Men fell quiet as she passed. They stepped aside. They watched her like they used to watch me. Because leadership isn't only who holds a sword, it's who holds the room. Back in my chamber, the candles burned low as dawnlight slipped in. Jimena sat by the bed and took my hand. Her grip was gentle but firm, like she was anchoring me to the world for as long as possible. My fingers relaxed further in hers. And in the city outside, Valencia held its breath. Not because the enemy had disappeared, but because the legend was becoming a plan.
I didn't die with trumpets. No horns, no chant, no victory songs drifting up the stairwell. Just a room filled with candle smoke and sea wind, and the quiet moment when breath stops being a rhythm and becomes a memory. The chamber was dim, stone walls holding the night like a fist. Candle flames trembled beside a small wooden crucifix. Wax pooled and cooled. Shadows stretched and shifted, as if the room itself couldn't decide what to do with the fact of my absence. Jimena sat at my bedside with her back straight, hands steady, eyes clear. She held my hand as if she could keep the world from tilting by refusing to move. For a long time, she didn't react at all. That was her strength. Not that she didn't feel. She felt everything. But that she understood what grief could do to a city under siege. If Valencia learned I was dead, fear would spread faster than any arrow. Alvar waited outside the door in the torchlit corridor, shoulders squared, face set like iron. When the silence inside the room changed, when it became too complete. He knew. He didn't burst in. He didn't shout. He did what soldiers do when the unthinkable happens. He closed the door. Softly. The latch clicked. Wood settled into frame. The smallest sound in the world, and it became a wall. That was the first order of the new war. Secrecy. Outside, the keep continued to breathe. Guards changed watch. Patrols walked their routes. Lanterns swung in the fog. The routine stayed intact so the truth couldn't find a place to land. Jimena moved through the torchlit halls with measured steps. Not running, not panicking, just walking like someone who already knows what must be done and refuses to let the body betray it. In the council chamber, the officers were already splitting apart. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it argues. Hands tapped on maps. Voices rose. A fist hit wood. Not hard enough to break it, just hard enough to confess desperation. Men talked about the obvious. Without me, the wall would fall. Without me, the men would break. Without me, the enemy would smell blood in the air. Then Jimena stepped through the doorway. Black wool, veil, face pale, eyes steady. She didn't bring grief into the room. She brought authority. The argument died in her shadow. She put one hand on the table, calm voice, the kind that tells men to stop imagining and start obeying. She spoke with minimal gestures, no wasted movement, no softness that could be mistaken for doubt. There would be no open warning. There would be no rumor. The city would not be allowed to realize it was suddenly leaderless. And then she said the words that turned the air cold. Tomorrow, the gates would open. Not to surrender. To fight. The men stared at her as if she were insane. Olivar didn't. He watched her like he had watched me. And I saw in his face what soldiers recognize when they hear a plan that sounds impossible but might be the only thing left. Necessity. He nodded once. And the room became quiet in a different way. Quiet with decision. That night, the keep workshop let its goals low, and worked behind barred doors. Smoke curled over leather and iron. Craftsmen pulled straps tight, tested buckles, adjusted batting. The reinforced saddle frame, built in silence over days, was brought into readiness. No one called it what it was. A device to hold a body upright. A way to turn a man into an image. In the chapel, Jimena stood alone before candles and incense haze. She bowed her head, whispered a prayer, then lifted her face with the calm of someone asking forgiveness for a sin she will commit anyway. Because saving a city sometimes requires breaking something sacred. Back in my chamber, she approached the bed. She lifted the cloth edge once, then lowered it again. Her hand adjusted my collar with gentleness that hurt more than any brutality. It wasn't denial. It was a farewell turned into preparation. Alvar waded to the armory. Mail hauberks clanked as he lifted them. Leather straps hung in rows. Helmets caught torchlight. He chose what was needed. Not for battle, but for appearance. Armor that had weight. A surcoat that could be recognized. A sword that could be seen from a distance. Then the dressing began. Men who had ridden beside me for years moved with careful hands. They didn't speak. They fastened straps and tied knots. They placed cutletted hands where they belonged. They secured posture with hidden bindings so there would be no collapse, no slumping, no unnatural bend. It wasn't theater. It was carpentry and rope and discipline applied to something nobody wanted to touch. In the corridors, guards closed ranks. Sightlines were blocked.
doors were watched. Whispers were swallowed before they could become words. Outside the walls, the enemy shifted in the pre-dawn fog. Almoravid patrols poured forward a few paces, boots sinking in wet earth, spears steady. Scouts squinted toward Valencia, sensing weakness in a way that doesn't require spies. A siege has its own instincts. In the stable courtyard, Babieca stood in fog, lantern light trembling across its coat. The horse exhaled vapor, ears forward, calm, but alert. Handlers placed the reinforced saddle on its back with careful strain. Straps tightened to the last notch, buckles clicked. Then the heaviest work arrived. My armored body was carried through the keep, 4 soldiers sharing the weight, knees bent, steps synchronized, faces tight under torchlight, breath heavy, but controlled. They moved like men carrying a sacred relic, because in their minds that's what I had become. In the stable yard, they positioned the body beside Babieca, then lifted and seated it upright with slow, deliberate leverage. Straps were drawn tight around the torso, hidden fastenings held the hands. A sword was placed upright and secured so it wouldn't slip. Nothing floated, nothing bent wrong. Everything obeyed gravity and tension, and the ugly honesty of weight. Jimena stepped into the fog and touched Babieca's neck. Just once. A farewell to the horse, and perhaps to the man it had carried for so long. Then they moved toward the gatehouse. Chains rattled softly. Bolts were lifted. The massive doors began to part, creaking under their own weight. Fog rolled out like breath leaving the city's mouth. On the walls, defenders watched from above. Faces pale, eyes fierce. No one spoke. The plan was too fragile to survive a single careless sentence. Outside, Almoravid scouts noticed movement. Heads turned. A hand pointed. The enemy leaned forward in the saddle, hungry for the moment they'd been waiting for. And then, out of the fog, Babieca stepped through the gate. An armored rider sat upright in the saddle. A sword stood ready. A banner moved in the wind. From a distance, in the gray morning, it looked like the impossible. It looked like El Cid riding out again. The enemy hesitated. Fear ran through the front line faster than commands. A step back, then another. Officers shouted with sharp gestures, trying to pull discipline back into place. But superstition and rumor don't care about officers. They care about images. Behind the mounted figure, Alvar's cavalry surged out in a tight wedge. Horses accelerated from stillness to motion with powerful realism. Lances lowered, shields angled. The charge wasn't meant to annihilate. It was meant to break the rhythm, to crack the enemy's confidence, to buy one more breath. On the wall, Jimena raised a signal. Archers loosed a controlled volley, bows drawn with steady strain, arrows arcing down into fog and dust. The clash of the trench edge was brutal and fast. Lances struck shields, bodies recoiled. Men fell. Horses pushed through with weight and momentum. Dirt churned under boots and hooves. And for a moment, only a moment, the enemy line wavered. Some units pulled back. Some soldiers retreated without meaning to. Their fear did more damage than steel. Inside the gatehouse, defenders' halls hauled on some chains, pulling the doors back toward closing. Heavy wood moved with slow certainty. Metal scraped, the gap narrowed. The sortie ended not with celebration, but with control. Babieca was led back through the fog. The mounted figure remained upright and still as it disappeared into the city's shadow. The myth returned inside where it could be dismantled in truth. Jimena stood alone on the battlement as the fog lifted, revealing the enemy camp still fast, still patient, still hungry. She lowered her hand slowly, shoulders straight, face calm. The plan had worked. Not forever. Just enough. In a siege, enough is sometimes the difference between a city that collapses today and a city that lives to choose what happens tomorrow. And that was Jimena's real victory. She didn't bring a dead man back to life. She used his name to buy time.
The morning after the sortie, the fog thinned, but the danger didn't. Outside Valencia, the Almoravid camp regrouped with the cold precision of men who don't stay frightened for long. Officers walked the lines, pointing, tightening, restoring rhythm. Shields were raised again, standards stopped wavering, the machine reset itself. On our walls, the defenders exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for an entire season. Hands loosened around spear shafts. A few men let their shoulders fall for the first time in days. The city was still standing. But no one who understood sieges called that a victory. Ximena stood on the battlement in her black veil, wind pulling the fabric like a tide. She lowered her signaling hand and turned away with the controlled steps of someone who already knows what comes next. Because the truth was simple. The story had bought us time, and time had to be spent wisely. She went to the chapel first. Candles burned low in the incense haze. Stone arches held the quiet like a secret. Ximena stood before the altar, hands clasped, then slowly released them as if unclenching a fist inside her chest. She whispered a prayer, not for triumph, but for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what she'd done and for what she still needed to do. Then she went to the council room. Maps lay open under oil lamps. Ration ledgers sat like accusations beside them. Alvar and the officers gathered in disciplined silence now, fear hammered into purpose. Ximena pointed to routes and gates, to the roads that could still be used before the enemy closed them entirely. A wooden marker slid across the parchment, not hold, not fight, but something harsher. Withdraw. The word wasn't spoken aloud, but everyone felt it land. Because they all understood what she did. Valencia could not be held forever. Not with the Almoravids outside, not with supplies shrinking, not with the one man whose name held the walls together now resting in silence behind a closed door. The legend had been staged once more, and it had worked. But legends don't feed people. So the next act was not spectacle. It was logistics. In the stable courtyard, Babieca stood calm in the thinning fog, breath rising in pale plumes. The reinforced saddle and straps, the grim device that had carried the myth, waited nearby like a tool that had done its job. Inside the keep, men loosened buckles and released straps with careful hands. The armor was removed, the posture bindings undone, the truth separated from the image. Rodrigo Diaz, my body, was prepared not for battle now, but for transport. No applause, no speeches. Only hands doing necessary work. In the chapel's side room, cloth was folded, armor pieces laid out, candles burning steady. Ximena supervised with the same calm she used when counting grain. She adjusted a color once, smoothed fabric once, and then withdrew her hands as if leaving fingerprints on history would cost too much. Meanwhile, Alvar moved like a man building an escape out of stone. He inspected bolts and chains at the gatehouse. He rehearsed sequences with the crews, who lifts which latch, who pulls which rope, who gives the signal, when the carts roll, how the last man cover the movement. He didn't talk about courage, he talked about timing. Outside, the enemy still waited, dark standards, disciplined patrols, a pressure that didn't sleep. The ring of campfires remained, and when night came, the sea mist carried their glow across the fields like an omen. Inside Valencia, life began to change shape. Carts gathered quietly in the streets, pack animals were loaded without shouting. Civilians carried bundles with bowed heads, trying not to look like they were leaving. Ropes were tight around sacks and chests, wheels were checked, axles greased. Every squeak became something to fear. In a siege, escape is not a dramatic run, it's a slow, careful subtraction. Before dawn, the postern latch lifted. Metal scraped softly in the lantern spell. A breath held, a pause, because the smallest noise can become a death sentence. Then the convoy began to slip out of Valencia under the cover of fog. Carts rolled at a controlled walk along orchard roads, mules pulled with visible effort, guards kept spacing, nobody spoke above a whisper. The city behind them stood silent, as if it didn't want to admit it was being abandoned. A few defenders remained on the walls to mask the withdrawal. They walked their patrol roads in steady cadence, turning at corners with ritual precision, so any watching eye would still see movement, still believe the city was holding. But inside, the streets had started to empty. A door remained closed too long, a shutter stayed down, a cat crossed a quiet lane and vanished into shadow. The city was becoming a shell.
On the road, Ximena rode near the front, posture straight, rein steady in her hands. She didn't look like a woman fleeing. She looked like someone relocating an empire's last dignity. At a hilltop, she turned back once. Valencia was a distant silhouette now, its walls softened by haze, the sea behind it pale and indifferent. The banner on the keep was still visible, small and lonely. Then she faced forward again. Because looking back too long is how you get caught. Later that morning, the Almoravids began to notice. Movement on the walls was different, too quiet, too thin. Officers pointed, orders snapped through ranks, the discipline machine began to advance again across the fields, dust rising under boots. Valencia was lost, not because the legend failed, but because reality always returns. And yet, the convoy kept moving. At a roadside shrine, a weathered cross stood on a stone base, a ribbon fluttered in the wind, the escort passed without stopping. Faith wasn't a performance on this road, it was simply carried. By afternoon, they rested near a stream, straps were checked on the covered bier, knots tightened, cloth settled, the sacred cargo remained secure. At night, campfires burned low, smoke drifted under faint stars. Ximena sat near the covered bier, silent, then stood again with controlled motion, refusing to let exhaustion take her posture. A tear formed once in the firelight and didn't fall. Even grief had to obey discipline. In time, they reached sanctuary, stone walls, a monastery or fortified church, where candles burned in quiet and incense softened the air. Clergy met them with bowed heads and measured gestures, and the bier was lifted again, shoulders and arms straining under real weight, then carried into an inner chapel. There, under a vaulted stone ceiling, Rodrigo Diaz was set down gently. Not as El Cid on a horse. Not as a miracle. As a man. Candles trembled in a draft inside, wax pooled, smoke curled, the quiet felt heavier than any battle. Ximena placed her hand once on the cloth. Then she withdrew it. That was the final farewell. Outside, Valencia continued to fall into the hands of the patient army that had waited for the story to end. And far away, Alvar received news, perhaps in a torchlit chamber, perhaps with a map beneath his fingers. He could be silent, he could be cold, but even a king cannot stop a legend once it has been released into the mouths of ordinary people. Because the last victory wasn't the sortie. The last victory was the story. Years later, in a marketplace far from the walls in the fog, a traveling juggler would lift a lute and sing of El Cid, how he rode out when no man should ride, how enemies stepped back from a dead commander, how a city held one more day because people chose to believe. And a child in the crowd would look up with my eyes, asking without words if it was true. The juggler wouldn't need to answer. Because truth isn't always what happened. Sometimes truth is what kept people alive long enough to keep walking. The sea still breaks against Valencia's shore, wind still snaps cloth on poles, roads still stretch across the Iberian plain. Men die. But stories. Stories right on.